In the middle of tremendous darkness and personal tragedy, false lights are trying to guide us, and they can bring shipwreck. We must be focused on God's pathways and His light in the storms of life. Christ is the light of navigation. Hello, and welcome to the Light of Navigation and the God Stories. My name is Marguerite Lever-Woodall, and I'm an author, speaker, and your host. I write short stories about real-life supernatural encounters with God. And I love to explore what it is and what it means to follow God's pathways. In this episode of the God Stories, called God in the Arms of Communion, there's a powerful story here about a brief glimpse beyond the veil into heaven's realm at an unexpected time. For me, Christmas Eve was never the same. Come, join me in the adventures of the God Stories and experience the encounters with the goodness of God, even in the middle of our life's storms. As I sat in the church sanctuary and stared at the Christmas tree that night, I noticed that its height almost touched the ceiling. It was massive and very beautiful. Sitting in the front row of the church sanctuary, I'd waited to take communion with my pastor and his wife, with my nephew by my side. It was our pastor's tradition to do so with each family or individual on Christmas Eve every year. There was a pause for a minute or two in remembrance of what Christmas was all about. Then the partaking of the bread and wine together followed. Sometimes a prophetic word would be spoken as God's Spirit moved when we prayed. This communion was difficult for me as my son Randall had passed from a drug overdose 2 months before. My nephew John had recently turned 34, and when he'd learned of Randall's death, he joined me during the holidays that week. As a struggling addict himself, he was reaching out to me in my darkest hour. My son's addiction had not been as lengthy as John's when he overdosed. In fact, John was in shock and disbelief that he hadn't died first instead. Everyone else had expected it to happen to him first, but not my son instead. I appreciated his gesture of comfort and support, and I knew his heart was grieving with mine. I'd been praying for John for several years. I'd sensed that there was a powerful destiny spiritually that was meant for him. However, he'd been drawn away from it through addiction. He seemed to briefly touch or tap into the spiritual realm at times, and it would be out of the blue when least expected, and the presence of God would manifest as well. It was as though his calling would peek through in his life off and on, despite the addiction battle he was in. He knew that God had set aside a powerful ministry for him, provided he ever yielded to God's will in his life rather than his own. John lovingly offered to sit with me during the communion service on this Christmas Eve. In retrospect, I knew he was offering to be a son for a few moments that night. As the four of us sat there, we prayed, then took communion, each of us holding a small thimble-sized glass of grape juice in one hand and a small piece of bread in the other. The grief overwhelmed me momentarily as I sat there, and then subsided. John turned to me afterward and said, Auntie, I saw a second pair of arms and hands running parallel on both sides of mine when I took the communion. In those moments, I scrambled mentally to take in what he had just said. As we rose and walked away, I asked him to share it once again. He replied, I saw a second pair of arms and hands running parallel on either side of mine. The hands were holding the wine and the bread, too. They were taking communion with me at the same time as I did. I understood in that moment that he'd seen something spiritually in the communion, a glimpse through the veil between heaven and earth, and the unseen was allowed to be seen. It was evident in his voice that it was unexpected and unsettling to him, almost fearful. He had not expected it, and my mind was trying to understand what had happened to him. In an effort to reassure him, I responded with my first probable explanation. It must have been the arms of Christ taking communion with you, John. With adamant conviction in his voice, John quickly and firmly replied, No, Auntie. They were Randall's, your son. It didn't dawn on me until I wrote this story 2 years later that my son was also taking communion with me. Thank you so much for listening today. If this story would be an encouragement for someone you know who's going through a loss on a difficult holiday, please pass it on. Your comments, as always, are valued, and subscribing is appreciated. Stay tuned for the next God Story episode that's coming soon. God always surprises me with his goodness, and I can't wait to see what he's going to do next.